You're listening to Trace Hunt Radio. We explore the darkest chapters of true crime, unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and the twisted minds behind them. Follow the blood, chase the clues, uncover the truth. Stay sharp. The hunt begins now.
Beneath the bustling streets of an old European city lies a hidden world, a labyrinth of tunnels carved centuries ago to house the dead. Millions of bones line the walls, stacked like grim mosaics of history. For most, the catacombs are a reminder of the past. But for investigators, they became the scene of a modern nightmare. What began as a tourist's wrong turn transformed into one of the most chilling murder files ever opened. Deep in the unlit passages, where maps fade and echoes carry too far, bodies began to appear, fresh remains disguised among ancient bones. At first, police dismissed them as misplacements, accidents, or perhaps lost wanderers. But as forensic teams dug deeper, the pattern became undeniable. These weren't accidents. Someone was hunting in the dark, using the catacombs as both hunting ground and graveyard. The killer knew the tunnels well, slipping through the labyrinth unseen, arranging victims in ways that mimicked the centuries-old displays of skulls and femurs. Locals began to whisper that the catacombs themselves were alive, swallowing the living into their endless silence. Tonight, we follow the trail of the Catacombs Murder Files, how the first body was found, how investigators unraveled the maze of evidence, and how the darkness beneath the streets concealed a predator no one believed could exist. The catacombs had always been a place of whispers, a labyrinth beneath the city where the bones of millions were stacked into grim mosaics, skulls and femurs forming walls that stretched endlessly in the damp dark. But in 2011, the silence was broken when Daniel Foster, a young photographer from London, wandered away from the guided route in search of the perfect shot. He ducked through a rusted gate into an unlit corridor where the air grew thicker, the stone walls narrower, and his flashlight beam trembled over piles of brittle debris until he realized it wasn't ancient bone at his feet, but something terrifyingly new. A fresh body slumped against the wall, clothing still intact, a wristwatch faintly ticking, surrounded by skulls that had been carefully arranged into a circle as though staged for display. He froze, snapped a photo, and stumbled back through the maze until he found his way to the tourist path, pale and shaking, clutching proof that the catacombs had swallowed more than history. Authorities at first dismissed his claims until the photograph forced them underground, where they found the body of Lucas Bernard, a university student missing for 2 months. His life ended by blunt force trauma, his corpse curated among the centuries-old dead. The arrangement mimicked the artistry of the catacombs themselves, echoing the decorative bone patterns tourists admired, only now with flesh and fabric woven into the tableau. And investigators realized with a chill that the tunnels beneath the city were not simply a monument to the past, but an active hunting ground, a hidden gallery where someone was building exhibitions out of the newly dead. 2 months after the first discovery, when Lucas Bernard's body had barely left the headlines, municipal workers surveying a collapsed passage stumbled upon another display. This time, a young woman, propped upright against the damp wall as if seated among the centuries-old dead. Her hair braided with bone fragments, while femurs had been stacked into the shape of a cross at her feet. The realization settled in quickly. The killer was not hiding bodies. They were sculpting with them, mimicking the catacombs' historic artistry. Forensic archaeologists were called to distinguish ancient bones from the recent dead, and their analysis revealed that both murder scenes lay near old display zones, where skulls and femurs had been carefully arranged hundreds of years before. Soon, a third chamber was uncovered, this one containing 3 men arranged in a triangular formation, their skulls crushed and placed at their feet, chalk markings covering the walls. Some of the symbols matched graffiti scrawled by explorers in the late 1990s, suggesting the killer was recycling the catacombs' layered history, fusing the old and the new into grotesque exhibits. Profilers began sketching the outlines of a mind obsessed, someone with intimate knowledge of the labyrinth, artistic fixation, and absolute control over their victims. A predator who didn't merely use the tunnels to dispose of bodies, but treated the catacombs themselves as the canvas for their art. As fear gripped the city, tourists canceled trips, locals avoided entrances, and graffiti appeared warning, "The catacombs take the living," while investigators cross-checked missing persons reports and found disturbing overlaps. Young explorers, artists, and travelers who vanished without a trace, like Sophia Klein in 2009 and Adrian Morel in 2010. Their names echoing in chalk on walls where bodies were later found. What investigators now understood was chilling. The killer was building a gallery beneath the streets, one display at a time, arranging the newly dead to echo the designs of centuries past, turning history itself into their hunting ground. With 2 staged corpses already discovered beneath the city, investigators knew they were no longer dealing with a single act of madness, but with a predator who understood the catacombs better than anyone else. And to track such a killer, they would need help from those who lived in the tunnel's shadows. The cataphiles, illegal explorers who mapped, marked, and breathed the hidden world that lay beneath the streets. These men and women had their own legends of secret chambers, chalk arrows leading to forgotten halls, and whispers of footsteps that didn't belong to their crews. And reluctantly, police turned to them for guidance, forming uneasy alliances in the hunt. With their help, maps long thought accurate were expanded into tangled webs of corridors, narrow squeezes, and flooded passages, each one another possible crime scene. Some explorers admitted they had come across strange arrangements before, skulls stacked neatly where they shouldn't be, femurs aligned in symbols no tourist would ever see, and they had laughed it off as pranks, never imagining they were glimpsing the killer's unfinished work. Search teams pushed deeper with ropes and floodlights, while cataphiles guided them through airless shafts, where a wrong turn could mean never resurfacing. Then came the next discovery, a chamber hidden beyond a collapsed arch, where candles burned low in bottles and wax dripped onto damp stone, the walls lined with chalk sketches of spirals, crosses, and circles, some drawn decades ago, others fresh. In the center lay another victim, positioned carefully with skulls forming a halo above the head. For investigators, it was the proof they dreaded. The killer wasn't just hiding bodies, he was performing rituals, creating private exhibitions for no audience but himself, in the deepest dark where no law had ever reached. The catacombs were no longer just a backdrop to history or tourism. They had become the killer's canvas, and the city above trembled knowing the labyrinth beneath their feet was alive with murder. When the forensic teams began examining the scenes more closely, what emerged was a language of death, written in bone and chalk. A system of patterns that transformed the murders from mere killings into a sequence of rituals echoing the catacombs' own history. The victim found beneath the halo of skulls was arranged in almost perfect symmetry, with an ancient wall display documented by archivists in the 1800s. And when investigators overlaid photographs, the alignment was exact, down to the angle of the femurs. This was no coincidence. Whoever the killer was had studied the catacombs as both historian and artist. weaving centuries-old motifs into modern crime scenes. Forensic anthropologists painstakingly separated old bone from new, tagging fragments of jaw, ribs, and vertebrae that had no business being alongside artifacts from the 17th century. While chalk symbols traced across the walls matched both explorers' graffiti from the 1990s and sacred geometrical forms used by catacomb workers centuries before, as though the killer was layering history, using every mark of the tunnels as raw material for their grotesque gallery. DNA confirmed at least 3 more victims, missing over the past decade, each one folded into displays that imitated spirals, crosses, and arches found in mapped tourist sections. The chilling realization set in that these weren't random bodies hidden in the dark. They were deliberate installations, constructed with knowledge of archaeology and ritual, designed to blur the line between museum and mausoleum. And as more chambers were discovered, lit by flickering candles long since burned out, investigators began to see the catacombs themselves not as a hiding place, but as a living exhibition hall, where the killer walked the same paths as guides and tourists above, curating his horrors unseen, turning history into a mask that concealed the present. Above ground, the city changed almost overnight as word of the catacombs killer spread from tabloids to national broadcasts, transforming centuries-old tourist lore into a living nightmare. What had once been sold as a quirky destination for travelers became the backdrop for whispered warnings, with hotels reporting mass cancellations, street vendors closing early, and graffiti blooming on walls near metro stations that read, "The catacombs take the living." Families of the missing gathered in vigils, holding photographs by candlelight, demanding answers from police who could only promise the labyrinth was being searched piece by piece. Though everyone knew it was impossible to fully police a city beneath a city. Shops near entrances felt cursed, losing business as locals avoided streets where old gates led downward, and realtors quietly dropped prices in neighborhoods that backed onto forgotten shafts. Meanwhile, thrill seekers and illegal explorers surged in number, drawn by the horror, slipping past barricades in hopes of glimpsing the killer's art, sometimes returning wide-eyed with stories of wax stubs, chalk spirals, or the sound of dripping water when no pipe ran above. In town hall meetings, residents argued bitterly over whether to seal every entrance forever, even if it meant erasing a cultural monument, while others insisted the tunnels must remain accessible as history. Fear spread in subtler ways, too. Children whispered ghost stories about skulls rearranging themselves. Lovers avoided evening walks near entrances, and entire districts seemed to breathe uneasily, as though the ground beneath their feet could at any moment give way to darkness. The catacombs were no longer a place of the past. They were present, alive and feeding terror into every corner of the city, reminding its people with each headline that beneath their homes, someone was still arranging bones. As investigators mapped the spreading trail of corpses beneath the city, psychologists were brought in to interpret not just what the catacombs killer did, but why, and the portrait they painted was more chilling than the crime scenes themselves. For this was not the chaos of a mad drifter or the brutality of a random predator, but the method of a curator, a man who saw the tunnels as his private stage and the dead as materials for his art. Profilers noted how each display echoed historic arrangements made by workers centuries earlier, suggesting the killer studied the catacombs with obsessive devotion, committing their symbols and patterns to memory, then recreating them with living victims to blur the line between museum artifact and murder exhibit. His choice of victims, wanderers, tourists, artists, those drawn to the underground by curiosity or thrill, reflected not convenience, but ritual selection, as if he believed their presence in the tunnels marked them as sacrifices worthy of incorporation into his grotesque gallery. Experts argued he was driven by a hunger for permanence, a desire to create something lasting in the dark where no sunlight could reach, transforming fragile human bodies into installations that would endure like the centuries-old bones surrounding them. To him, silence was control. His victims could no longer scream, no longer resist, no longer escape. Yet in their posed stillness, they became eternal companions, frozen exactly as he intended. Forensic psychiatrists described it as a collision of loneliness, obsession, and control, where the catacombs, labyrinthine, eternal, indifferent, became both accomplice and canvas, offering him anonymity while feeding his compulsion. And so the killer was no longer imagined as merely a murderer hiding in tunnels, but as a shadow artist, carving his immortality out of death, his mind inseparable from the stone corridors and the endless walls of bone. As the investigation deepened, detectives realized that the killer's macabre artistry could not exist without logistics. And so they turned from the shadows of the catacombs to the cold trail of paper and numbers that might expose how long this underground gallery had been in the making. Analysts cross-referenced purchase orders from ceramic suppliers and candle shops, tracing shipments of plaster, paraffin, and pigments that seemed innocuous until their delivery addresses were mapped. Always near forgotten maintenance shafts or disused sewer lines that linked directly to the catacombs. Power company records showed irregular surges late at night in certain underground substations, as though hidden kilns or makeshift equipment had been drawing energy far below the streets, spikes that eerily aligned with the dates victims had last been seen alive. Receipts from wig suppliers and costume warehouses revealed orders for human hair wigs and theatrical props that echoed details later found braided into corpses, while chalk and limestone powder purchases tied back to the crude symbols scrawled across tunnel walls. Investigators began interviewing delivery drivers, some of whom admitted they had hauled heavy crates to unmarked cellar doors without asking questions, paid in cash by a quiet man who insisted on silence, while others remembered the strange smell of damp and wax seeping from the packages. When forensic accountants layered all of this data onto a timeline of disappearances, the picture was staggering. The pattern stretched back more than a decade, perhaps longer, suggesting the catacombs killer had been working methodically, staging exhibit after exhibit, his paper trail woven invisibly into the city's commerce. The revelation was as terrifying as the crime scenes themselves. The killer wasn't improvising. He was building a secret institution beneath the streets, one supply order and one victim at a time, his operations hiding in plain sight while his gallery grew in the dark. When the case finally broke into the open courts, the city was forced to confront horrors it had long pretended were only whispers. And what followed was less a trial than a reckoning. A public debate over whether the catacombs were to remain a monument of history or forever be tainted as the hunting ground of a predator who had turned them into his private gallery. Families of the victims crowded the courthouse steps, holding faded photographs in trembling hands, demanding answers and dignity, while journalists framed every headline with the words, "Catacombs Killer," turning grief into spectacle. Inside, prosecutors laid out the evidence like a grim exhibition. Photographs of staged bodies, DNA samples, ledgers of supply purchases, and the chilling chalk symbols that mirrored ancient designs. But the loudest debate was not about guilt. Everyone knew a killer had walked those tunnels, but about what to do with the remnants of his crimes. Some families pleaded for every staged display to be dismantled, the bones returned to sacred rest, the corpses laid to proper burial, while archivists argued that destroying them would erase evidence, erasing history itself. Voices cracked in the gallery. "That's not art. That's my daughter's hair in a circle of skulls," shouted one mother, silencing the chamber. Outside, activists called for sealing every entrance to the catacombs forever, while preservationists insisted they could not erase centuries of cultural memory because of one man's crimes. In the end, the city ordered the killer's displays cataloged and sealed in restricted vaults, inaccessible to the public, but preserved for forensic truth, while the catacombs themselves were partially closed, their entrances guarded, their legend forever stained. The reckoning left no one satisfied. Families mourned, historians protested, and citizens whispered that the darkness beneath their feet could never be trusted again. But the city had spoken. The killer's gallery would not vanish, nor would it ever again be seen. Even after the courts were finished and the entrances were sealed, the shadow of the catacombs killer clung to the city like a fog that would not lift, shaping the lives of those above ground long after the tunnels below had gone quiet. Families of victims tried to resume ordinary routines, but found themselves haunted by every crack in the pavement that might conceal an entrance, every basement stairwell that seemed to slope toward the dark. And for many, the simple sight of a porcelain mask or a child's toy skeleton in a shop window was enough to trigger grief, dread, or anger. Businesses near the old entrances never recovered, tourism evaporated, and locals avoided whole neighborhoods as though they carried contagion, while thrill seekers and amateur ghost hunters still prowled at night, hoping to catch fragments of the legend, leaving candles and chalk marks that only deepened the unease. The children of Hollowbrook, those who had grown up during the investigation, carried the stigma like a brand, taunted as doll kids or bone rats by outsiders. Their school books doodled with skulls and spirals, and many left the city the first chance they got, unwilling to live under the weight of history's heaviest secret. Meanwhile, the story grew into something larger than the place itself, retold in documentaries, novels, horror films, and podcasts, each one turning the killer into a symbol of obsession and silence, ensuring that his presence lingered in culture even as his body was never found. Police academies used the case as a training exercise. Professors dissected it as an example of societal neglect, and paranormal forums speculated endlessly about unfound chambers still hiding deeper horrors. The legacy of fear was not just the murders, nor the catacombs themselves, but the realization that beneath the streets we walk every day might lie entire worlds unseen, where shadows thrive and silence becomes their accomplice. And for the people of the city, that was a wound that never healed. When the last reporters left the courthouse and the barricades around the catacomb entrances began to rust, many believed the story of the catacombs killer was finished, but in truth, it never ended. For even as the official files were sealed and the exhibits dismantled into evidence vaults, unanswered questions continued to bleed through the silence, casting long shadows that time could not erase. Investigators knew from the ledgers and symbols that more victims existed than those recovered. Entire arrangements referenced in chalk notes or described by explorers years earlier but never located, leaving the terrifying possibility that deeper within the unmapped maze lay hidden galleries still intact, waiting in darkness where no one dared go. And then there was the killer himself, never caught, never conclusively identified, vanishing into the labyrinth as if he had become part of it, swallowed whole by the city's underworld. Some believed he died in the tunnels, lost like so many explorers. Others swore he escaped, blending back into ordinary life above, watching from the crowd as news anchors called him a phantom. Families carried the weight of that uncertainty like a curse, unable to bury the idea that their children's murderer might still be breathing. Culture, too, refused to let go. Documentaries replayed the haunting images, books theorized endlessly, and tourists returned in trickles just to stand at sealed gates and imagine the horrors beneath. Yet for those who lived with it, the case remained less a story than a warning. That beneath every city, every place we call familiar, there are layers unseen. Tunnels where silence covers screams, and where someone patient enough, obsessed enough, might still be arranging bones. In the end, the Catacombs Murder Files closed without closure, leaving only shadows that remind us some mysteries are never solved, only endured.